Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. It was meant to be a regular night. Outside, the wind howled and brushed the rain against the old factory's broken windows, but inside, darkness covered every corner. The faint flicker of a broken bulb revealed Sienna's trembling face as her voice broke through the silence. "Matt, please don't do this." Her trembling between disbelief and fear made her words barely audible. Bound to a chair, her hands were raw from trying to escape. Matt's shadow hung over her, no longer the man she had once trusted but a faceless, obsessed, and hateful individual. His cold smile sent chills down her spine as he stepped closer, the smell of gasoline and rust filling the air. "You ruined everything," Matt hissed, pacing back and forth like a predator. "You and that golden boy, Nick. You think you can just walk away from me?" His fury cracked his voice. Sienna's hands trembled as she covered her swollen belly as tears streamed down her face. She was terrified, not just for herself, but for the fragile life inside her. She had just found out she was pregnant, and the timing couldn't have been worse. She had planned to tell Nick about their baby, and the future she dared to imagine that night. She was now, however, looking into the eyes of a man who had already taken too much from her. "Please, Matt," she begged again, her voice breaking. "I'm pregnant, please don't hurt me." However, her words only stoked his rage. As a twisted grin spread across his face, his eyes became darker. "Pregnant? His baby. You think that changes anything?" He slammed his fist into the wall beside her, the sound echoing like thunder. Sienna flinched violently, her body tightening in panic. "You took everything from me, Sienna. Every chance I had, every ounce of control. You made me a fool." Meanwhile, across town, Nick was pacing his apartment, dialing Sienna's number over and over. She had not attended dinner. She had not responded to his messages. He felt it in his bones that something was wrong. He tried to convince himself she was just late, but the unease gnawed at him like a beast. When her voicemail picked up for the 5th time, his heart dropped. Then all of a sudden his phone buzzed with a message notification. A single text message from Sienna's number. "Help me," caught his breath. Nick's world froze. He called the number back, but there was no answer. The fear took over. He was out the door in a matter of seconds, speeding through the wet streets in his car. He knew exactly who was behind it, Matt. The same man who'd been stalking Sienna. The same man who refused to accept that she had moved on. He had promised her that Matt was done, that he'd never hurt her again. That promise now seemed like a cruel lie. Back at the warehouse, Sienna's cries filled the air. Her voice was raw, desperate, echoing off the cold concrete walls. "Matt, please, you're scaring me. I'm begging you, don't do this." She struggled against the ropes, her wrists bleeding. Matt's laughter was unhinged as he circled her, taunting her with memories of what they once were. "You think you're better than me now? You think he loves you more than I ever did?" She was forced to look at him after he grabbed her by the chin. "Sienna, you are mine. You've always been mine. Don't touch me," she screamed, twisting away. But he tightened his grip. His rage boiled over, and in one violent motion he shoved her back too hard. She stumbled, her chair tipping, crashing against the floor. Pain exploded through her body as she hit the ground. Her breath was labored. And then horror struck. A sharp, unbearable pain surged through her abdomen. Her eyes widened as the realization set in. "No, no, no, no," she gasped, clutching her stomach. Matt was frozen. For a moment, even his fury faltered as he saw the pain twist across her face. But instead of helping, he backed away in shock. This is your fault," he shouted, his voice shaking with denial. "You made me do this." Sienna's cries turned into sobs, her body shaking uncontrollably. "Please, I need help," she whispered weakly, her voice fading. Blood stained the floor beneath her, and the horror of what was happening hit her all at once. She was losing the baby. Miles away, Nick followed the GPS ping from Sienna's phone, his heart pounding like a war drum. Every red light was a curse. Every second felt like an eternity. When he finally spotted her car abandoned near the industrial district, his fear turned to full-blown panic. He ran into the storm and yelled her name. "Sienna!" His voice echoed through the night, but only the sound of thunder answered back, until faintly he heard it. A scream. Help me! He followed the sound, kicking through a rusted door that led into the warehouse. The smell of gasoline hit him first. Then he saw her, lying on the ground, pale, trembling, blood pooling beneath her. Sienna! He yelled and hurried toward her. But before he could reach her, Matt appeared out of the shadows, holding a metal rod like a weapon. Matt snarled. You shouldn't have come here, Nick. You ruined everything. She was supposed to choose me. Nick's fury ignited instantly. Matt, you are insane. You've hurt her enough. He lunged forward, blocking a swing from Matt's weapon. The two men clashed violently, fists flying, metal clanging. Rivalry and animosity that had existed for years burst into chaos. Nick's knuckles split open, blood smearing across his hands as he fought with every ounce of strength. Behind them, Sienna groaned weakly. Her vision blurred as she tried to focus on Nick, her savior, her love. She wanted to call out to him, but her voice was gone. She felt as though the life she had inside was vanishing and shed tears. The fight raged on. Nick evaded Matt's subsequent swing and tackled him to the ground. You're done! Nick roared, slamming his fist into Matt's face. The weapon slammed to the ground, reverberating throughout the room. Breathing hard, Nick grabbed Matt by the collar, ready to end it once and for all. You'll never hurt her again, he growled, punching him one last time before throwing him aside. As he held Sienna in his arms, he rushed to her, his hands shaking. Sienna, stay with me. Please look at me. His desperate voice broke out in a crack. She blinked slowly, her lips quivering. Nick, I tried to fight him. I didn't want to lose. She ran out of words. Her body trembled, her pain unbearable. Nick's tears fell freely as he pressed his hand to her cheek. You're going to be okay, baby. Promise. I'm going to get you out of here. He pulled off his jacket and pressed it against the bleeding, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Stay with me, Sienna. Please. Sirens blared in the distance. Someone had heard the screams. Relief and terror mixed in Nick's chest. Although he could see the outside flashing lights, he was aware that the harm had already been done. Sienna's sobs turned to silence as her body went limp in his arms. No, no, no. Nick cried, shaking her gently. Don't treat me like this. Don't you leave me. He could feel her faint pulse, but it was slipping. Paramedics rushed in moments later, pulling Nick back as they tried to stabilize her. One of them yelled, She's lost a lot of blood. Nick stood still and covered in her blood as they carried her to the stretcher, his eyes watering with shock. Even as he was forced into the squad car and dragged out of handcuffs by officers, Matt sneered bitterly. She was mine, he muttered under his breath, but his voice was drowned out by the rain. At the hospital, Nick sat outside the emergency room, his head in his hands. His knuckles were bruised and his shirt was still stained. The doctor finally emerged, his expression grim. He said softly, She's stable. But, I'm sorry. She lost the baby. The words hit Nick like a thunderbolt. He felt the air leave his lungs, his heart shattering in silence. With tears streaming down his face, he pressed his forehead against the icy wall. Sienna had survived, but the child they dreamed of, the future they had whispered about, was gone. He sat by her bedside hours later. Sienna looked pale, fragile, her eyes filled with tears when she woke. Nick, she whispered. I'm here, he said, clutching her hand. You're safe now. She blinked, her voice breaking. The infant. Nick's eyes glistened as he shook his head. I'm so sorry. Sienna turned away, crying softly but deeply. It's my fault, she whispered. I couldn't protect our baby. No, Nick said firmly, pulling her closer. This is not your problem. Matt did this. And he's never going to hurt you again. Police stood guard outside the hospital room, waiting for Matt to regain consciousness so they could take his statement. The story, local woman kidnapped by ex, rescued by heroic partner, was already getting a lot of attention from the media and spreading like wildfire. But for Nick and Sienna there was no victory. Only loss, only pain. Days later, as Sienna sat in silence by the window, her hands folded over her stomach, Nick placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. We'll get through this, he whispered. I swear it. She nodded faintly, her eyes distant. "He took our baby," she said softly. "However, he did not steal my will to live. I'll make sure he pays for everything he's done." Nick looked at her with quiet determination. "Then we'll do it together." The storm outside began to fade, the first light of dawn breaking through the clouds. But inside them the scars would remain, reminders of a night filled with horror, heartbreak, and a love strong enough to defy the darkest evil. Because one truth remained despite the blood, screams, and loss. Sienna was alive because Nick arrived just in time. But the tragedy of what was lost that night would haunt them forever. The sterile white walls of the hospital did little to comfort Sienna as she lay motionless on the bed, her hand resting on the thin sheet that covered her body. The beeping of the heart monitor was steady, but her heart felt shattered beyond repair. The world had become eerily quiet since that night, the night she lost everything. Her body ached, but the real pain was buried deeper, in a place no medicine could reach. She had lost her baby, the little heartbeat she had once heard, the fragile miracle she had just begun to believe in, gone in an instant because of Matt's madness. Nick sat beside her, his fingers intertwined with hers. His eyes were bloodshot and he had not slept in 2 days, and his expression was hollow. He had repeatedly replayed the scene in his mind, including the moment he entered the warehouse, the sight of her bleeding on the cold concrete, and her expression of horror. Every time he closed his own eyes he saw it again, and every time it broke him a little more. "I should have been there sooner," Nick whispered, his voice trembling. "If I hadn't wasted time." Sienna turned her head slowly, her voice soft but pained. "You saved me, Nick. If you hadn't come when you did, I wouldn't even be here." Her eyes filled with tears as she squeezed his hand weakly. "You can't blame yourself," I said. But Nick was unable to let go of it. "I promised you I'd protect you," he said, his jaw tightening. "And I failed. I didn't just lose our baby. I let that monster touch you again." His voice broke on the last word, his rage barely contained. "Matt doesn't get to breathe free air after what he did. I will ensure that he perishes for this." Sienna looked away, staring blankly at the rain streaking the hospital window. The city outside carried on, unaware of the destruction that had torn her world apart. She whispered, "He took something from us that we'll never get back. But I can't let him take my soul too." Nick was perplexed, frowning. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said, her voice gaining quiet strength, "I can't let him win by making me hate him more than I love what's left of us. If I do, he still controls me." Her lip trembled as she spoke, and tears slid silently down her cheeks. "But it's hard, Nick. It's so hard to not drown in the anger." Nick leaned forward, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "Then I'll help you stay above it," he murmured. "We'll heal together. One step at a time." But healing wasn't going to be easy. The next few days blurred together in a haze of grief and hospital visits. Sienna barely ate, barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes she saw Matt's face, his twisted smile, his hands gripping her, the sound of her own scream echoing in her ears. The trauma replayed like a nightmare she couldn't escape. One evening, as she sat in her hospital gown, staring at the faint reflection of herself in the dark window, Nick entered the room quietly with a small bouquet of white lilies, the same flowers she'd once told him were her favorite. "I thought you could use something beautiful," he said softly. She managed a fleeting grin. She whispered, "They're perfect. Thank you." But when he set them beside her bed, her eyes flicked toward the TV in the corner. The news was playing footage of Matt being led into the courthouse in handcuffs. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and Matt's cold expression sent a chill down her spine. "Matt Clark has been charged with kidnapping, assault, and attempted murder," the reporter announced. Sources say his actions directly led to the loss of Sienna Blake's pregnancy. He is currently being held without bail pending trial. Sienna's breath hitched. The sound of Matt's name alone made her chest tighten. She reached for the remote and turned off the TV abruptly. "I don't want to hear his voice ever again," she said, her tone sharper than usual. Nick nodded, understanding. "You won't have to. He's done. He'll spend the rest of his life behind bars." But deep down, they both knew justice could never truly heal what had been broken. A week later, Sienna was discharged from the hospital. Nick insisted on taking her home, helping her walk slowly through the front door of the apartment they once shared. The familiar space now felt foreign, every corner a reminder of what they'd lost. The baby's ultrasound photo still sat tucked inside her notebook on the coffee table. She had just bought a small baby blanket on a whim just days earlier, and it was still folded in a drawer. As she entered the bedroom, Sienna's breath caught in her throat. The memories hit her like waves. The nights she and Nick had whispered about names, the morning she had woken up dreaming of a future that would never come. As her tears flowed freely, she sank onto the bed with one hand on her stomach. "It wasn't supposed to end like this," she whispered. Nick sat next to her and supported her with an arm around her shoulders. He said quietly, "I know. However, Sienna, we'll get through this. Somehow." Red and sparkling, she raised her head to face him. "You keep saying that," she said softly. "But how do you move on from something like this? How do you breathe when it feels like your heart's been ripped out?" Nick didn't have an answer. As she cried against his chest, he held her close and tightly. He said, "You don't move on, in the end. You just learn to live with the pieces. And maybe one day those fragments won't be as painful." Except for the occasional storm outside and the ticking of the clock, the apartment remained silent for days. Nick stayed close to her, making sure she slept and ate. However, he could hear her quietly clinging to her bed each night. She then screamed into the night as she was jolted awake from a nightmare. Nick rushed to her side, holding her as she trembled violently. He whispered, "It's okay. You're safe. He can no longer harm you." Sienna's breathing was ragged as she clung to him. She wept, saying, "I saw him. He was looking at me from across the room. I could feel his presence." Nick held her tighter. Even though he knew the fear was real, he murmured, "It's just a dream. He is incarcerated. He can't get close to you." However, something whispered in the back of his mind that this wasn't over even as he said it. Weeks passed and Matt's trial drew near. The mere thought of being summoned to testify made Sienna's stomach turn. She knew she had to confront him, not for retaliation but rather for closure, even though the trauma was still fresh. She and Nick entered the courtroom together on the day of the hearing. The whispers of reporters echoed from every corner, their cameras flashing as they caught sight of her, fragile yet defiant. When Matt was led in, his gaze locked on her immediately. The coldness in his eyes sent a shiver through her, but this time she didn't look away. Despite her heartache, she met his gaze with a firm expression. The prosecutor laid out the evidence, the kidnapping, the assault, the physical trauma that caused the miscarriage. Every word was a dagger, reopening wounds she tried to close. When it was her turn to speak, Sienna stood trembling before the courtroom. She said, her voice shaking, "Matt took away the most precious thing in my life. Nick and I had barely begun to imagine a future when he destroyed it. However, he also taught me something, namely that I can overcome his hatred. He no longer has ownership of me. Not my fear. Not my grief. Nothing." Nick's eyes welled up with tears as he observed this woman, who had been close to death but was now standing her ground in the face of the man who had broken her. Sienna's testimony was persuasive, and Matt's attorney attempted to claim mental instability. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom fell silent. Guilty on all counts. Matt's face twisted with rage as he was led away in handcuffs, shouting incoherently about betrayal and lies. Sienna did not hesitate. She felt something close to peace for the first time in months. Sienna watched the stars that night from the balcony of her home. The air was still cool and cool. Nick joined her and tied her waist with his arms. He said softly, "It's over." She gave a nod. "Almost." He made a head turn. "What's your point?" Sienna took a deep breath, looking out at the horizon. "He's done with it. But for me, I still have to find a way to live again, to forgive myself, to believe that I can still have a future." She turned to face him with sparkling eyes. "Do you believe that is possible?" Nick brushed a strand of hair from her face, his gaze tender. He replied firmly, "Yes. Because I believe in you. And I'm not going anywhere." Sienna smiled weakly. "I don't know how I got to have you so fortunate." "You didn't get lucky," he said with a faint smile. "You fought to survive. That's strength, not luck." For a long moment they stood in silence, holding on to each other as the night carried away the ghosts of what once was. However, there would be a long road ahead. Over the following months, Sienna began therapy, slowly piecing herself back together. There were setbacks, nights of crying, moments of doubt, but there were also small victories. She started painting again, something she hadn't done in years. She used the canvas as an outlet for the pain she couldn't express verbally. Nick supported her through every step. He witnessed the transformation of the woman he loved from a broken survivor into a stronger, more self-assured, and even more compassionate individual than she had been previously. Sienna sat quietly for a long time one day, while cleaning out the drawer where she had kept the baby blanket. Then she folded it neatly, tied it with a ribbon, and placed it in a box. When Nick found her, she told him, "I'm not throwing it away. I'm keeping it," as a reminder that love existed, even though it was brief. Nick knelt beside her, his eyes soft. He said gently, "And maybe we'll have another chance one day." Sienna's lips trembled into a small smile. "Maybe," she whispered. "But for now, I just want to live." Months later, on a crisp morning, Sienna found herself standing before the mirror. The reflection staring back at her wasn't the fragile woman who'd once begged for her life. She was stronger now, scarred but standing tall. She looked in the mirror at Nick when he came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" he inquired softly. "Thanks for saving me. Not only that evening, but each and every day since." Nick smiled faintly. "You saved yourself, Sienna. I simply refused to let you overlook your strength." And in that moment, the silence between